Hi there and welcome to a new episode of Extreme Banding, the slow YouTube camera channel dealing with various photographic nightmares. I am living in one of them right now, December in the north of Sweden. Weather is so-so and the sun never rises. There's no time or place for photography, so what can you do? Think about which all-mechanical rangefinder camera with a cost below 1,000 euros you would like to use for the rest of your life, perhaps. The Canon camera company started off by making Leica-inspired cameras in 1936, first with their own mounts, but later on with the standard Leica screw mount. They produced about 600,000 cameras with Leica screw mount before joining the SLR revolution. But as build quality was high, many of them can still be found today. The first Canon cameras were made in small batches though, and I would have liked to have started out with the first real development with Leica screw mount, the Canon S2, which combined the Viewfinder rangefinder. But as that one has eluded me, we will start this walkthrough with their last bottom loader, the Canon VSB2, released in 1954. By some considered to be the best bottom loader ever made. It's got the combined rangefinder viewfinder, and Canon had this kind of viewfinder set up for some of their later bottom loading cameras. And then you can set, you have here a 0.7 finder, which is perfect for a 50mm lens, and no frame lines, but a nice finder. The base length is a little short then it's 0.7 times this distance. So, but that is more if you want fast shooting with a 50mm lens, stop down preferably. And then you can use the 1-to-1 finder, so good for keeping both eyes open, for example. And then if you want the best focusing accuracy, you can go to 1.5 times finder. A nice idea, of course. Here's the Canon VSB2 50mm frame, and it is quite a bit darker than the other ones, darker than the Canon 7. And I've had to clean this out as well. I think there's something with the construction of the rotating viewfinder in the Canons that make them, attract dirt. So this is the way it looks, and then we have the 1-to-1 finder. This probably corresponds to 100mm lens or less, and then the 1.5 finder, which should be about a 135mm lens. So of course easy to focus. And an advantage of the Canon VSB2's switchable finders is that you can switch while keeping the camera to your eye, which you can't with the L1 and the V-L. This is very easy. Other upgrades were, it has a slow speed dial like the Leica 3s. It also has 1,000 of a second as the top speed, and a dial that you lift to change shutter speeds, so doesn't matter if it's before or after, what shutter speed you have set. A knob wind, which I like. Yeah, that's about it. They added this, unfortunately, this flash bracket, which really is not something you would use today when using these cameras. Of course, nice and silent, not when no lens is mounted. Nice shutter, bottom loading, just like every other bottom loader. A very nice build quality. However, that is also one of the drawbacks of this camera. It is very heavy. It weighs in at 545 grams, which is substantially heavier than this is a Soki one, but a Leica 2, which weighs 410 grams. So this one has a 1-to-1 finder and a separate 50mm viewfinder, instead of this, which combines a lot of things into one. So, and as you can see, the original, it's a bit smaller in all dimensions, not as tall. It's, you know, the depth is the same, but it's a little bit less wide, a little bit less tall, and weighs over 100 grams less, which is substantial. And this one only has 1/500th of a second. A more, you know, direct comparison would be this is like a 2F, but a 3F would have been kind of the same. This one also weighs 410 grams. It has diopter correction, which can come in handy. It also has 1/1000th of a second. It's a bit bigger than the original Leica, but still smaller than the Canon. So the Canon IVSB2 has more features, but is both a bit bigger and substantially heavier than the Barnack Leicas, both the Leica 2s and Leica 3s, the Model Ds and Model Fs. Another drawback of this camera is that the knob in itself is a bit slippery. So it works, of course, but it's, you know, it feels better to do this than this compared to like a 2F. It's much easier to get a grip on this knob, and you can feel that the mechanism is a lot more crude, but on the Soki you really get a good grip of this. Ergonomics, of course, excellent. The only thing that gets in the way is the slow speed dial, and it does still have this rotating dial, which can get, if you have gloves for example, and you touch this, you might ruin an image. There, nice camera, a lot of more features than the Barnack Leicas, but you know, I would say that the features are not worth the extra size and weight. If you want a 0.7 finder, there are better options for that. If you want a 1-to-1 finder, you have the original Leica 2 Model D. If you want a 1.5 finder, well, you have the Leica 2 and 3F, for example, 3C, etc. Because if you use these ones, either they're made for something like 85 and 100mm lenses, don't know exactly. You can use them for that, or otherwise you can use them with an auxiliary finder. But a really nice camera, nonetheless, and a super good build. Anyhow, this came out in 1954. And, well, the Leica M3 was also released then, so suddenly cameras such as this one became dated overnight, if you wanted to compete with the Leica, that is, because this kind of camera is still, in my opinion, they are very difficult to beat if you want to have fun shooting film. But they, anyhow, moved on, like everyone else, with more features and larger cameras. So this is the Canon L1, released in 1957. It, of course, the body shape is new. It retains most other functions, such as slow speed dial, 1/1000th of a second here. It has added a winding lever, which some people like, some people don't. I used to like knob winds, but you know, they feel really good. This one needs a bit of lubricant or something. But other than that, you know, it stays in this position and it's really nice to wind. A bit difficult to operate one-handed, but you know, why should you? It has a 1.5 finder, it has a 35mm finder and a 50mm finder combined. New thing is the film loading mechanism, which a lot of people thought was a blessing. There, voila. Very easy to load film in this one, of course. No need to trim the leader or anything. Still a cloth shutter in this one. And the ergonomics are really, really nice. Feels nice to hold. The only thing in the way is this one. And you know, you still have this rotating dial issue. It's about the same weight as the Canon IVSB2. It weighs 540 grams. It is a little bit bigger. There's a difference in width, small difference in height. Also, since this one is a bottom loader, there's also a difference in thickness, about 2 millimeters. So, but still I must say that the Canon body feels very nice in hand. The increased thickness is not as evident as on the Soviet cameras, even though on most of them it's the same. It's kind of like a Fed 2. The Soki 3s and 4s, they are 1 millimeter thicker, I think. This one is broken, but originally they had auxiliary finders with automatic parallax correction, which of course was a stroke of genius. So you can pin this thing to change viewfinder, and there are no frame lines, it's just but clear frames. You have the 1.5 times magnification, you have a 35 millimeter, and that's maybe 0.5 times magnified, so the base length is really, really short. It has a good high eye point, and I think the Canon L1 has the only, except for maybe, these very low magnification cameras like special Leicas with 0.58 times magnification and the Bessa with 0.52. I think this one is the only one where it's easy to frame with a 35mm lens with a built-in viewfinder. Focusing is, however, a bit tedious since things are so small in the viewfinder. The base length is not very long either, but very good for use with glasses, for example. And then you have a 50mm finder, which is the standard 0.7, which is the best for 50mm finders. And it's a nice finder. This is the 35mm frame lines, or not frame lines, the frame. And well, it is very easy to see the edges, but as things get really small, it's a bit difficult to focus. So we change to the 50. So things get a bit bigger. Well, it's a good 50mm frame, 0.7 times magnification. And a bit short viewfinder base, but should be okay. But more accurate is always better. So, but then if you want more accurate, you can go to this 1.5 times magnification. I guess that corresponds to a 135mm lens approximately. So then it's very easy to focus. A problem with these viewfinders is that they are often dirty, and so I've had to clean this one, and it seems like you have to do that almost for all of these L1 and V-L cameras, and some have deterioration of the coatings and are not possible to clean. Other than that, nice viewfinder. Again, you have all of these options. The only thing that bothers me is really this one, except for, if you compare to these cameras, it is substantially bigger. And when compared to this one, bigger, better 35mm built-in viewfinder, but this one, if you use an auxiliary viewfinder, this one is smaller. And you can use a 1-to-1 finder on this one, which you can't on this one. An upgrade, of course, but it's not really that clear-cut. If you like the 35mm finder in this one, it's a good thing. For me, I think too difficult to focus with the 35mm finder. But I guess you can get used to it. So, but a nice camera. It's out in 57. So, of course, if you start weighing in at 550 grams almost, the elephant in the room is the Leica M. This Leica M2 was released in 57 as well. As you can see, they're about the same height. The Leica is substantially smaller this direction. It has parallax corrected frame lines, 0.7 finder, 35, 50 and 85mm frame lines, rewind crank, easy film loading. Not as easy as this one, but almost the same thickness, more or less. Pretty similar cameras, but you know, and this has a longer base length as well. So the difference is, of course, the price. It's very hard to find this one though, especially in good condition, as the finders tend to deteriorate. Sort of an upgrade and sort of a match here, but of course the same weight and size. The Leica M2 is, of course. You know, you can't compete with this one on its own terms. But this one is a lot cheaper, and the 35mm viewfinder is much more usable for framing and if you have glasses. The next Canon upgrade was, well, there was a model between this, the V-L, basically the same as this one, but the viewfinder deteriorates even more over time. I have seen a few of them, and the rangefinder patch was not in good condition on any of them. Anyhow, Canon introduced this, the Canon P, in 1959, and this is actually a substantial upgrade. It looks exactly the same as the L1, but now it has a non-rotating dial, which is super, especially if you want to use with gloves. All the slow speeds are up here, so it is much nicer to hold. The wind crank is just as good. The weight is the same. It's 20 grams heavier, this one. It is a tiny bit bigger, maybe 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters taller, maybe 1 millimeter wider. The viewfinder, it's a 1-to-1 finder with parallax corrected frame lines for 35, 50 and 100 millimeters. It's very nice to use. You can use both eyes open. The 35mm frame lines, for me, I think they're not really usable. Of course you can use them in, you know, emergency, but I would rather have an auxiliary finder here as well. But actually that goes for the Leica M2 for me as well, even though that one is more usable than this one. When you use both eyes open though, you know, that's an advantage if the frame lines are really at the edges. But so this one has decent base length for accurate focusing, and it's very nice to use. I would say that this is, if you're not really bent on using 35mm lens and want good framing, then the L1 is probably better, but you can probably learn to live with this. Or maybe I would actually rather use an auxiliary 35mm finder with the Canon P than use the internal on the L1. This is the viewfinder of the Canon P, about the same brightness as the Canon L1, slightly darker, but a bit less contrasty. It can flare a bit, and as you can see, you have the same kind of phenomenon as the Canon 7, that there's something, you know, when it comes to the depth of the rangefinder patch is kind of layered in some way. It's not a big problem, but it's there. We have a good base length here and parallax corrected frame lines, and you can see the 50s okay, and you know, in the center you have the 100, but to see the 35s you really have to, you know, look around. And for me they are not really visible with both eyes open either, because with the 50 you get to see things on the side. Since it's a 1-to-1 finder, keep your eye open and just expand the view like that. It's an easy way to do it, but with the 35mm frame lines I just don't see them. But maybe if you can get your eye really close to the viewfinder, maybe you can. So, decent finder, good with the 1-to-1, so then it's pretty comfortable to use with auxiliary finders as well. The Canon P was really the cheaper version of the Canon VI-L, which you can see here. This is actually my second Canon VI-L in the rare black version, as I felt I had to try it once again for various reasons. Anyhow, the Canon VI-L has everything the Canon P has, really. There are a few differences though. First off, the body is a bit more ornate than the Canon P. The differences are very subtle though, but they are there. It has, you know, all speeds up here and a non-rotating shutter speed dial. it does also have some things that the Canon P doesn't. The Canon VI-L has this pin which allows for parallax correction with Canon external viewfinders. The next thing is this system which we know from before with the rotating viewfinder. We have a setting for 35mm, no frame lines, just a frame for 35mm, 0.65 times magnification. Then we have this, which is similar to what we have in the Canon P, 1:1 viewfinder with 50mm parallax corrected frame, as well as a 100mm frame in there. So that is similar to the Canon P, but on the VI-L, the 35mm frame lines, which we have in the finder on the Canon P, and that I find barely usable, here on the VI-L it is a separate 35mm finder, which is much more usable for framing. I would say though that magnification is a bit high to frame comfortably, but I'm sure you can get used to the finder in this one much easier than you could get used to the frame lines on the Canon P, for example. And then we have the 1.55 magnified finder. And this finder gives us an effective base of about 67 millimeters. It's one of the most accurate rangefinders around. We can check this out as well. It has the back that opens, metal shutter curtains, and here's the wheel where you switch finders. So is this an improvement over the Canon P? Well, it weighs 20 grams more, which, well, I guess you can live with, but it's a quite heavy camera at 587 grams. The switchable finder is of course welcome, but unfortunately the finder seems to deteriorate more than on the Canon P. The reason I bought this camera again was to have another example of the finders. And I think the finder of the Canon P seems to age better. Still, if you're a right-eyed shooter, you can use the 50mm frame in this one with both eyes open, and then the dimness of the finder really doesn't have much of an effect. So that is a minor problem. But still, it's something to consider since this camera is quite hard to come by compared to the Canon P. The Canon P was produced in about 87,000 units and this one in maybe 10,000. So other than that, I think might be the copies I've had, but it feels like the Canon VI-L might be built to a bit higher standard than the Canon P, but this is really nitpicking. This thing is nice, but especially for long lenses, as the wide lenses, such as when you use this 28mm finder, it does move, but parallax isn't that much of a problem with a 28mm finder, and this finder is a bit big. I actually prefer to use something like this Voigtlander 28mm finder. You won't have parallax correction then, but it is smaller and it has usable frame lines, whereas this Canon finder it's nice enough, but it is quite big and there are no frame lines in this one, just a frame. But so for long lenses such as a 135mm lens, the Canon VI-L is pretty much ideal since it is very accurate when using the most magnified view in the rangefinder, and parallax correction is really nice with longer lenses since it does make quite a lot of a difference there. If you can find a VI-L in good condition, it is a great buy if you find it for, a decent amount of money, but otherwise the Canon P is just as good, I would say, and easier to find for a good price. The next upgrade in 1961 was the Canon 7. This was followed by the Canon 7S, and that was the last Canon rangefinder. Of course, an attempt to challenge the Leica M series. This one included a selenium light meter, which actually still works on this camera. also frame lines, which you could select like this for 35 millimeters, 50 millimeters, and 85 and 100 millimeters. Those are combined. There's also frame lines for 135 millimeters. These frame lines are parallax corrected. The magnification of the viewfinder is about 0.8, a bit higher magnification than the Leica M2. It works fine. The 35mm frame lines are actually a bit easier to see in this one than in the Leica M2, but that is because they are actually smaller than 35mm. The coverage is lower than with the Leica M. So here we have the Canon 7 with the 35mm frame lines. Can't really get all the way against the viewfinder because there's a thing sticking out on the Canon camera. But as you can see, the 35mm frame lines, they are parallax corrected, and the rangefinder patch is there in the center, but it's a bit... There's some kind of strange optical phenomenon in the viewfinder of the Canon 7. It's like you see something there in the middle in different, depths of the image, but I guess it's a nice viewfinder. Not the nicest, but it has parallax corrected frame lines. 35. Here's the 50. You have a lot of space around them. There's 85, 100. So they're a bit small. And the 135. That's how it looks. But still, this dial, which does not rotate, basically, otherwise it's the same. Has the matte shutter curtains, and of course easier film loading than the Leicas. What can we say about this? Well, first and foremost is that it is quite a bit bigger than the Canon P. It is taller, tiny bit wider, and while it's the same thickness where you grip it, it is thicker in the top. That doesn't really matter when you hold it. But it is substantially heavier at 622 grams. Compared to the Leica M, well, of course, depending on how you see it, I kind of like this selenium part here. But of course, the Leica M, to my eyes, it is prettier and it is smaller. It also has the better finder, even though frame lines can be easier to see in this one because of the lower framing accuracy. If you like a big camera and a light meter, well, like this selenium light meter, which works without a battery, Canon 7 is of course a great option and really good for the price. Because even though these Canon cameras, if you compare them directly to the Leica M2, I would say that they are not as nice as the M2. I mean, the winding, everything is just perfect. The ergonomics, perfect. But these cost a lot less, maybe 5 or 6 times less money than this one. And even though, depending on how you see it, the value is still good on this one, as probably the value will be more stable and probably increase more over time than this one, depending on what happens. The trends come and go. But still, it sometimes feels nicer to carry around something that isn't worth a lot of money. So you don't have to be that worried about dropping or losing them some way. And then you of course have an argument for the cheaper cameras than this, such as the Soviet ones. But anyhow, I would say for me, I do prefer this one, the 7, the least, because of the size. And then the Canon IVSB2, even though it's kind of a mechanical marvel, I think it's just, should have been lighter because it really competes against cameras that are much lighter than this one. And then we have the L1, which is, you know, very nice if you want an internal 35mm finder, but in other ways I think I like the Canon P the most, and it is also more common than the L1, for example. But they are all very, very nice and capable cameras. You can read about, you know, that cloth shutters have a nicer sound than metal shutters. Otherwise the metal shutters are to prefer, since they are more durable to, you know, they won't burn a hole in them. Anyhow, we mounted two pretty similar lenses here on the cloth shutter L1 and the metal shutter Canon P, and you know, these cameras are pretty similar in size and so on. So let's start at fast shutter speeds, 1,000 of a second here, L1, Canon P. So slight difference, we can do 1/25 of a second, L1, Canon P. So slightly lower sound on the L1, it seems to me. L1 on 1/60th of a second, and on the P. They are, you know, I wouldn't notice it in normal use. Let's do 1/30th of a second. L1, P. And there's, at 1/30 and slower, you get this noise from the metal shutter. Like something's moving afterwards. You can have 1/8 of a second here. Okay, nothing there. And 1/15th of a second, it's there. 1 second, it's there. So on the slower speeds you have that kind of residue sound, which is not present on the L1. And we have the same thing with the Canon 7. On 1,000 of a second, nothing strange. On 1/30th of a second you have that, 160, nothing. It's really nice to turn the dials on these two cameras as opposed to the older versions. Yeah, you can hear for yourself, different pitch, but I would say they're in the same ballpark. So, shutter sound of the Leica M2. On 1/30th of a second you have this extra sound. Of course, you can hear it more in the Canons than on the Leica. But as this shutter sounds more than this one, in all respects, I don't think this is just caused by the metal shutter here. It's some kind of more modern shutter design than on the previous cameras. So if we take the VSB2 into consideration, that's in 1,000/5 of a second. Well, it's hard to decide. Maybe this is the best one of them. So if we would compare the Leica 2F shutter sound to the 4SB2. The SB2 actually has a better speed dial selector. 2F at 1,000 of a second, 4SB2. Let's do 1/50th on that one and 1/60th this one. 2F, 4SB2. We compare it to a Soviet copy of the Leica 2 Model D. This sound on 160. So that is actually pretty good. Bit louder than this one, but 1/500th of a second. That's concerning shutter sound. I think the Canon VI-L and Canon P overall represents the best of the Canon rangefinder cameras. We have the non-rotating speed dial. We have a 1-to-1 viewfinder with parallax corrected frame lines. We have metal shutter curtains so you won't risk burning holes. But is it preferable over a Barnack? It does weigh over 150 grams more for the Canon P and 170 grams more for the Canon VI-L. The size difference is huge, and in hand, while this camera is very nice to hold, it is not as nice as this one, especially because of the lightness. And as for me, this winding lever is really good. It's fast, it's easy to grip, but in my opinion, well, this one needs some service. It doesn't beat the feel of this. And you have a 50mm frame built in here if you want to go compact. If you want a 1-to-1 finder, you can put the Leica S-Boy finder on here, which is very small and one of the best finders you can find. If you want a wide angle lens like a 28, you still need an external finder, and this package is much smaller than this. I would say the Canon P and Canon VI-L, especially the Canon P, is perhaps the most rangefinder you can get for the money, but I would still rather get a Leica 2 or a Leica 2 copy, such as the Soki 1 or Fed 1 camera in good shape. But I have to say that it's very difficult to go wrong with a Canon rangefinder. To conclude, Canon made a lot of nice rangefinder cameras. The Canon IVSB2 took the Barnack design a step further with its rotating combined viewfinder rangefinder. It is one of the best built cameras I've ever handled. The build quality and added features are unfortunately also its weakness, as those things add size and weight, which puts it in the class of larger rangefinder cameras. Adding to that, the shiny winding knob is a bit slippery, and the rotating viewfinder system seems to attract dust and dirt. The Canon L1 is a very nice camera indeed, not much bigger than the IVSB2, while adding easier film loading and a built-in 35mm frame. It is in many ways bettered by the Canon P and VI-L, but the viewfinder is brighter overall than its followers, and the patch is superior. The 35mm viewfinder is the best of the Canons for framing. I find the magnification to be a bit on the low side for focusing though, and it is difficult to find a camera where the viewfinder is in good condition. The Canon VI-L and P are, for me, two of the best value rangefinder cameras out there. Metal shutter curtains, non-rotating speed dials, and 1-to-1 parallax corrected frame lines for 50mm are the highlights. They do, however, have some kind of layered rangefinder patch, which is not best in class. And while they have built-in solutions for 35mm lenses, I prefer external viewfinders. Compared to a Barnack, they are also substantially bigger and feel maybe a bit too much on the modern side. The Canon 7 has all the bells and whistles and is available for surprisingly little money if you look around. It is very big, however, and the layered rangefinder patch system is very prominent. The 35mm frame lines are parallax corrected, and I would prefer it to the solutions in the Canon P and VI-L. Unfortunately, its viewfinder is darker overall, and as an overall package, I would say the P and VI-L are nicer. It is very hard to go wrong with a Canon rangefinder camera. They are great users, but none of them fills me with the joy I get from gripping a Barnack. And functionality-wise, when using lenses 50mm and wider, they really do not add anything essential. Maybe the elusive Canon S2 could trump the Barnack on its own territory. That is, however, something for another day.